The road that ate men alive. There's a man named Buster Burris who ran a wrecker out of Amboy, California. Buster carried a saw in that wrecker. Not a wood saw, a hacksaw. Because on the stretch of road he worked, when drivers went off the curve and hit the guardrail, the rail didn't stop them. It impaled them. The metal post went through the door, through the seat, through the man. And the only way to get the body out was to cut the rail free first. He had, by his own account to the researchers who documented this road, a litany of stories about death in the Mojave Desert. That was how he put it. Not memories, not incidents. A litany, like a prayer that never ended. That was Route 66. The Mother Road, the Main Street of America. 2,448 miles of dream paved over nightmare, stitched together from wagon trails and animal paths and dirt tracks that turned to black gumbo in the rain and baked to cracked concrete in the summer heat. They sold it as the road to California. They sold it as freedom. They sold it as the American future made visible and drivable and, supposedly, safe. They built it with machines that could crush a man to paste, and operators who had no safety glass, no backup alarms, no OSHA investigator waiting to ask questions, no one coming to help if something went wrong at 2 in the morning in the Texas Panhandle. They routed it over switchbacks so steep that cars had to climb them in reverse because the engine couldn't pull fuel uphill from a gravity-fed tank. They sent it through a pass in the Black Mountains of Arizona, where the hairpin curves were so violent that drivers with money paid locals to take the wheel because they were too afraid to drive it themselves. They called it Bloody 66. And they weren't being poetic. Here's the question that never gets asked at the souvenir shops and the nostalgia diners and the restored gas stations. How do you build 2,000 miles of road across a continent in 12 years? Through desert and mountain and swamp and dust bowl, with machines that had no hydraulics and no enclosed cabs and operators who learned the job on the job or didn't learn it at all. What did it take? What did it cost? Not in dollars, in men. Before this is over, you're going to know exactly why they called it Bloody 66. You're going to know what the steamroller weighed and what it did when it ran the wrong direction on a live work site. You're going to know what the black gumbo of the Texas Panhandle did to machines and the men operating them. You're going to understand what it cost to drive a pull grader along the edge of a 500-foot volcanic cliff with no cab and no guardrail and no one within screaming distance. The blood didn't start with the drivers. It started with the men who built it, the road that wasn't there. On November 11th, 1926, the United States government drew a line on a map and called it U.S. Route 66, Chicago to Los Angeles. 2,448 miles, one continuous road connecting the heartland to the Pacific coast. Here was the problem. Most of it didn't exist. When the federal designation was handed down that November, exactly 800 miles of that 2,448 were paved. The rest, more than 1,600 miles, was gravel roads, dirt tracks, stretches of brick, patches of wooden planking, and wagon ruts that a Model T could navigate if the driver picked the right line and held his breath. In New Mexico alone, the state could boast only 28 miles of hardened pavement before Route 66 came through. 28 miles, in a state that the highway would cross for more than 500 miles. This wasn't a road-building project. It was a stitching together of everything that already existed and calling it a highway. The federal system didn't build Route 66 from scratch. It inherited it. The road ran over old Spanish colonial trails, over the Santa Fe Trail, over wagon routes worn by settlers heading west before the Civil War. In New Mexico, sections of what became Route 66 had been traveled since the 1700s. Animal paths widened by horses, deepened by wagon wheels, carved into the earth by a century of movement and necessity. The government drew the number 66 over the top of all of it and told the 8 states It crossed to fill in the gaps before anyone noticed how wide those gaps really were. 8 states, 8 different highway departments, 8 different standards for what counted as a road. Illinois wanted concrete. Oklahoma paved with brick in some stretches and left bare dirt in others. Texas put down a strip of gravel 18 inches wide over black clay soil and called it a highway. And in the gaps where the states ran out of money or political will, there was nothing at all. No surface, no grade, no indication that a federal highway was supposed to be running through there. In the early months after designation, there were no uniform signs. Drivers trying to follow Route 66 navigated by a patchwork of local road markers, painted rocks, and directions from gas station attendants who'd learned the route by trial and error themselves. People got lost on the main street of America with regularity. The numbered highway was real on paper. On the ground, it was more of a challenge. The antagonist here wasn't any single mountain or any single storm. It was the continent itself, 2,500 miles of geography that had been killing and breaking people and equipment for centuries before a car ever tried to cross it. And now someone had decided you could smooth all of it flat, bind it with coal tar and concrete, and declare it the road to the American dream. Could they actually do it? The answer was yes, eventually. But the machines that built it were barely up to the task. The men who ran them had almost no protection from the machines or the terrain, and the road they built would earn its nickname in blood before the last stretch of concrete ever cured. And the blood didn't start with the drivers. They'd declared a highway. Now they had to build it, and the only question was how many men the building would take. Iron wheels on broken ground. The machines that built Route 66 were not the machines you picture when you think of highway construction. No GPS-guided graders, no air-conditioned cabs, no proximity sensors, no kill switches, no automatic anything. The workhorse of 1920s road building was the pull grader, a massive steel blade on an iron frame dragged behind a traction engine or a crawler tractor. Companies like Galleon Iron Works out of Ohio had been building them since before the First World War. By the mid-1920s, they were manufacturing pull graders capable of moving enormous quantities of earth, with blades that could be raised, lowered, angled, and tilted by a series of hand-operated cranks and levers. Galleon's slogan was "All roads lead to Galleon." Along Route 66, that was close to literal. You muscled that blade into position and held it there while the tractor dragged it forward, the steel edge biting into the roadbed, shaving the surface down to something approaching level. Could it handle what Route 66 was asking of it? On flat Illinois farmland, yes. On a volcanic hillside in New Mexico with a 500-foot drop on one side? That was a different question entirely. The operator stood on an iron seat, no suspension, directly above the blade assembly. If the grader hit a buried rock and the blade kicked back, the frame could shatter and throw steel fragments in any direction. If the tractor bogged down in soft soil and lurched free, the grader could jackknife, and the operator had nothing to hold onto except iron handles that could take a hand off if the machine moved wrong. The early bulldozers, just modified Holt farm tractors in the 1920s, still called bull graders, had crawler tracks for traction, but no protective roll cage. If one tipped sideways on a slope, it rolled. The operator went with it. Men learned to read the ground ahead of those machines the way sailors read water, because one bad second of inattention could put the machine and its operator at the bottom of whatever was on the left side of the road. There was no cab. There was nothing between the man and the mountain. And then there was the steamroller. The steam-powered road roller was the machine that finished the surface. The iron cylinder that compressed freshly laid gravel or macadam into a firm, level road. They weighed anywhere from 6 to 15 tons. The front drum was solid iron, 4 to 5 feet wide, moving at a maximum speed of about 2 miles an hour. It ran on coal or wood fed into a firebox under the boiler. Operating one required managing 3 separate controls simultaneously: forward, reverse, steering, and throttle, plus monitoring the water level in the boiler, tending the fire, and maintaining the lubrication of the drive mechanism. Get the water level wrong, and the boiler could run dry and crack under the steam pressure. Get the throttle wrong on a grade, and the machine lurched forward without warning into whatever was in front of it. But here is the thing that made the steamroller truly lethal on a construction site. The operator had to stop the machine, climb down from the seat, and refuel the boiler by hand, while the roller sat on a live road surface, on grades that could allow a 15-ton machine to begin rolling with nobody at the controls. And when the roller moved in reverse, the only warning system was the operator's eyes and whatever noise he could produce over the sound of the boiler. Workers standing in its path had one chance to see it coming and get clear. If they were bent over a shovel, if they were working in a drainage ditch, if the wind was carrying sound the wrong way, if they just weren't looking at the right moment, 2 miles an hour, 15 tons, no alarm, no reversing signal, just the ground trembling slightly under your boots if you happen to be standing close enough to feel it. Now put that machine on the edge of the Jericho Gap. In the Texas Panhandle, between the towns of Allen Reed and Groom, there was an 18-mile stretch of road that ran over black clay soil. When it was dry, it was firm enough to drive. When it rained, the clay transformed into what locals called black gumbo, soapy, dense, completely impervious to drainage. It adhered to everything it touched and accumulated on tires and machine tracks until the vehicle carrying it simply stopped. It didn't just slow you down, it held you. Some days the gumbo built up on workers' boots so heavily that each step required physically lifting the clay with the effort of the next stride. This stretch was the Jericho Gap. For the road gangs trying to lay gravel over it, the gap had no clean solution. The gravel sank into the clay, the drainage ditches filled and overflowed. The base material that should have supported the road surface wasn't there, because the clay expanded when wet and contracted when dry, heaving the surface into ridges and cracking the material apart. Every pass of the grader had to be done again after the next rain. Machines bogged down constantly. 2 tractors were harnessed in tandem on the worst sections just to maintain forward motion. The operators worked through Texas heat in summer and open panhandle wind in winter, in the open air, protected from neither. One newspaper article from the Shamrock Texan in October 1932 put it plainly: the Jericho Gap was giving the entire route a black eye, its impassable condition in rainy weather causing thousands of travelers to avoid the panhandle route altogether. Local farmers were not complaining. They positioned themselves at the edge of the gap with mule teams and charged stranded drivers to be pulled out. Business was so reliable that rumors persisted, never confirmed but never denied either, that some of them were watering the road down before storms to guarantee fresh customers. The machines ultimately lost. The alignment was moved entirely in 1936, rerouted a mile north to higher ground. The original path through Jericho vanished. The town faded with the road. By 1939, the population had been cut in half. The post office closed in 1955. The gap won. In New Mexico, the problem wasn't mud. It was stone, elevation, and 500 feet of vertical drop. The early Route 66 alignment in New Mexico descended to 0 feet between Santa Fe and Albuquerque through La Bajada Hill, a volcanic escarpment with 23 switchbacks cut into the rock face. Some of those switchbacks were so tight and steep that road-building equipment could not navigate them under its own power. Workers lowered machinery down sections of the grade by cable, piece by piece, then reassembled it at the bottom. The big cut north of Albuquerque and those La Bajada switchbacks were built primarily by human and animal muscle because the power equipment could not negotiate the terrain. Men with picks and blasting powder did what the machines couldn't. They cut a road into a cliff face by hand, and then the machines came through afterward and called it finished. The graders that did reach the upper slopes worked on gradients that pushed well beyond their engineered parameters. A pull grader on a 15% grade, on loose volcanic rock, with no guardrails and a 500-foot drop 30 feet to the left, was not operating within its designed safety envelope. It was operating at the far edge of what was physically possible before something went permanently, irreversibly wrong. And then there was Arizona, the worst of all of it. The Black Mountains of western Arizona were where Route 66 met the terrain that would make its reputation permanent. The road climbed from Kingman through a series of hairpin bends to Sitgreaves Pass at 3,595 feet, then descended toward the old gold mining town of Oatman. Building this road required drilling into solid rock on canyon walls, clearing ledge by ledge with blasting powder, then widening the path just enough for one vehicle to pass at a time. The drilling crews worked on cliff faces, with nothing beneath them except the canyon. Pneumatic jackhammers ran off hose couplings held by friction fittings. A coupling blowing under pressure sent a whipping air hose across a man's face or knocked him off the ledge before he had time to respond. Nobody was keeping count of how many times that happened. The Oatman Highway was finished. It was narrow, steep, and it was waiting. They'd built the road through the worst terrain on the continent. Now came the question that would take 30 years to fully answer. What happens when ordinary people try to drive it? The men who built it blind. Between 1933 and 1938, the men who finished Route 66 were mostly broke, unemployed, desperate for work that came with a wage. Roosevelt's New Deal sent them out in waves: the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Works Progress Administration. Thousands of young men from every state shipped to road gangs along Route 66 and highways like it across the country. The CCC paid $30 a month. 25 of that went home to the worker's family. $5 a month kept by the man on the end of the shovel. They lived in military-style camps, slept in tents until barracks were built, worked under Army officers with military discipline and military standards for what counted as acceptable conditions. The youngest were 17 years old. Some were older men with families who had nowhere else to go, and nothing to sell except their willingness to do hard physical work in conditions that would finish a softer man by 10 in the morning. The work was not glamorous: ditch digging, gravel spreading, culvert installation, running compaction rollers over fresh material, standing in the path of active traffic on half-finished road surfaces with nothing between them and the vehicles except a flag on a stick. No reflective gear, no physical barriers, no radio communication between sections of the work zone. No way to signal the roller operator from the bottom of a drainage ditch if something went wrong except to stand up fast and wave and pray the operator's eyes were pointing the right direction. Picture a 20-year-old from Illinois, shipped to the Texas Panhandle in the summer of 1934. His crew is laying gravel on the approach to a bridge crossing the Canadian River. The surface temperature on the roadbed is 130 degrees. He has been on his feet since 6 in the morning. His water ration is a single canteen for the day. The steamroller is coming up behind him at 2 miles an hour, slow, patient, completely indifferent to whether he is in the way. It weighs 15 tons. He weighs maybe 140 pounds. He knew the job before he took it. He took it because his family had not eaten the day before, and the alternatives were not alternatives. $5 a month. That was what his life was worth on that road. There were thousands of men like him. The CCC alone enrolled over 250 young men nationwide during the peak years of the program. In the Southwest, in New Mexico and Oklahoma, and Texas and Arizona, they were assigned to road gangs working Route 66 sections that other methods couldn't reach. The Civilian Conservation Corps ran in a military fashion, with company commanders and mess halls and reveille. The men wore military-issue clothing and ate military rations and followed military rules. But they were not soldiers. They were young Americans who had been hungry long enough to agree to anything, and the anything they had agreed to was this: laying a federal highway through the worst geography the continent could offer, with the tools available in 1934 for wages that wouldn't cover a week's rent in Chicago. The heat in the summer months along the Mojave and Texas sections was not merely uncomfortable. It was dangerous in the clinical sense of the word. Heat stroke was a risk on the paving crews from mid-June through September. Men working directly behind the steamrollers in the hot air column rising from freshly laid asphalt were standing in an environment that no safety guideline of the era had yet thought to address. They drank from canteens and they sweat it out, and they kept moving because the foreman was watching, and the $5 was waiting. The worst work was on the grades. On the New Mexico switchbacks of La Bajada, workers building retaining walls on the upper faces of the escarpment didn't just fall when something went wrong. They fell out of sight. The slope was steep enough that a man who went over the edge didn't stop rolling until he hit the canyon floor below. No harnesses, no fall protection equipment, no safety netting, no mandatory reporting of what happened to the men who didn't come back to camp that night. The warning sign eventually posted by the New Mexico State Highway Department on the finished road, which read, "This road is not foolproof but safe for a sane driver," was installed after every man who built it was already gone. On the Oatman Highway, the drilling crews worked on ledge faces above the canyon with pneumatic equipment that could malfunction and send them off the edge. The compressors that powered the drills were hauled up the same narrow track the workers used, one bad moment from tipping into the gorge. Nobody was insured. Nobody was going to be compensated. The men working those canyon walls understood exactly what they were doing and did it anyway, because the $5 a month was waiting if they survived to collect it. They kept working. The steamrollers required manual firing on live road surfaces. The operator climbed down to tend the boiler while the machine sat on a grade that could let it move with nobody at the controls. Burns from the firebox were routine enough that scarred forearms were a common mark on a paving crew. In the summer heat of the Mojave Desert approaches, freshly compressed roadbed surface temperatures could reach 150 degrees Fahrenheit. The roller operators sat on iron seats in open air at 110 degrees ambient temperature, above asphalt radiating heat like a griddle, breathing coal smoke and alkaline dust through nothing except a bandana over the nose and mouth. We don't know most of their names. The construction industry in the early 1920s had no mandatory fatality reporting. The states building Route 66 kept records, the way governments under pressure kept records, incompletely and with considerable interest in not discouraging future workers from taking the job. Across all sectors, the industry was killing approximately 30,000 American workers per year in the early 1920s. Road construction was among the most dangerous categories of that work. A leading skyscraper construction firm at the end of that decade admitted that one worker died for every 33 hours of employed time in the previous 10 years. Road work was not safer than building skyscrapers. We know men died on these grades. We know they fell from the La Bajada switchbacks. We know the rollers operated in places where a man in the wrong position had no margin whatsoever. The road was built. The ledges were cut. The culverts were laid. That is the record that survived, because steel and concrete do not forget the way paper does. The road was done in 1938, and it was ready to start collecting what it was owed. where the blood fell. In April of 1928, the Great Bunyan Derby, a transcontinental foot race from Los Angeles to New York, sent its competitors east across Route 66 as a promotional event, a way to put the new highway on the map and show the country what this road could do. When the field hit the Texas Panhandle, they ran directly into the Jericho Gap, days after an April snowstorm had saturated the black clay to its full depth. The entire support convoy, every car, bus, and truck following the race, hit the gumbo and stopped. Not one vehicle moved. The runners ran on through the mud, while the whole infrastructure of the event sat stranded in the gap, going nowhere, waiting for the ground to decide it was done with them. One runner fell in the mud, injured badly enough to drop out of the race entirely. That was 1928. Before most of the highway was paved, it was a preview. By the early 1930s, Route 66 was carrying Dust Bowl migrants westward by the hundreds of thousands, an estimated 210,000 people fleeing Oklahoma, Kansas, Texas, and New Mexico in overloaded vehicles, heading for California and jobs that might not exist when they arrived. They drove at night to avoid the desert heat. They drove in rain because they could not afford to stop. They drove on roads that hadn't been engineered for the weight of their vehicles at the speeds they were running, over bridges built to standards that predated the modern automobile, through mountain passes where the road was 1 lane wide and the outside edge dropped into nothing. The bridges started it. Early Route 66 bridges in Missouri and Oklahoma were built to standards from the teens and early 20s when a loaded truck weighed 3,000 pounds. By the late 1930s, vehicles were crossing at 15,000 pounds and more. Timber bridges in rural New Mexico were untreated wood that rotted quickly in wet seasons. Narrow concrete spans across Oklahoma creek crossings had no edge barriers. A car that drifted in the dark went over the side. In Plano, Missouri, 2 bridges acquired a reputation that lasted so long they became known locally as the Bloody Bridges. Narrow, blind approaches. No improvements for decades. They stayed in that condition until 1972, 12 years after Route 66 had already been realigned to bypass Plano. In Illinois, a tight curve outside Towanda became Dead Man's Curve. The original 1930s road alignment was narrow, poorly banked, with no sight lines for a car approaching it at speed. Missouri had Devil's Elbow, a sharp bend, a steep drop on the outside, and nothing between the curve and the cliff face. The record on Devil's Elbow comes from a man named Bill Roseman, who ran a fuel terminal in Staunton, Illinois, and whose words were collected by researchers documenting the highway's human history. He said Bloody 66 was a thing. Devil's Elbow was supposed to be the death corner of the world. I remember Dad would get white knuckles 10 minutes before we got there. White knuckles, 10 minutes out. That was what the engineers had built. The Mojave Desert section of Route 66 in California ran through some of the most unforgiving terrain on the highway. The desert didn't have mountains or switchbacks. It had something different. Extreme heat, remote isolation, and distances between towns so vast that a breakdown wasn't an inconvenience, it was a survival situation. The AAA had a category in their road guides for sections of Route 66 that should not be driven without extra water, and a full fuel tank with specific warnings about the desert sections between Needles and Barstow. Temperatures along that stretch in summer regularly exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Early radiators boiled over. Early rubber tires went soft and blue. And when a car went off the road in the Mojave in the 1930s, with no cellular phone, no emergency beacon, and no traffic behind you, because the road was that empty, the response time from any form of help was measured in hours, sometimes in days. Buster Burris in Amboy was the response system for his section of the Mojave. The wrecker, the hacksaw, the detailed institutional knowledge of exactly what the road did to the people who drove it. He was not an anomaly. Men like Buster existed at every difficult section of Route 66. They were the infrastructure that the infrastructure needed. In Groom, Texas, a flat stretch through Panhandle farmland was known as Death Alley, later Blood Alley. No mountains, no curves, just heavy oil-field trucks running the highway at full speed on a road with no center line and no shoulder, meeting oncoming traffic in the dark at a combined closing speed over 100 miles an hour. The flatness of the land was almost the problem. Nothing to slow anyone down. Nothing to signal the danger until the headlights coming the other direction were already filling the windshield and there was nothing left to do. In New Mexico, La Bajada was still collecting. Cars with gravity-fed fuel systems had to climb sections of the switchbacks in reverse because the grade was steep enough to starve the engine of fuel reverse up a mountain hairpin. With 1920s drum brakes that had already been cooking on the long descent, the brakes faded on the way down. Some cars did not make the bottom. The highway sign, posted by the New Mexico State Highway Department, read, "This road is not foolproof, but safe for a sane driver." They said nothing about what happened to the others. In Arizona, the Oatman Highway over Sitgreaves Pass was exactly what the drilling crews who built it above the canyon had always understood it to be. No guardrails on the hairpin curves. Loose gravel and then air and then the drop. Drum brakes burning hot from the descent from the pass. Fading exactly when the driver needed them most. Drivers coming from flat states, from Oklahoma and Kansas and Illinois, hit those hairpins without the mountain experience their lives had never given them. Some of them, reaching Kingman heading west, paid locals to take the wheel for the Sitgreaves crossing. They'd rather pay a stranger to drive them over the pass than attempt it themselves in a car they knew would not fully obey when the hairpin came. The night of September 27, 1942. Second Lieutenant Paul W. Taylor, 27 years old, was traveling east on Route 66 in Arizona with 5 fellow officers in a Chevrolet coupe, returning to Fort Leonard Wood after leave. The road was the Oatman Highway. It was dark, the winding road, the wartime traffic surge on Route 66, and the night converged at Winslow Creek. Taylor was killed. 5 officers, on official military orders, on a road the federal government had built and routed military traffic over, and had not yet fixed, and Buster Burris in Amboy kept his hacksaw in the wrecker cab where it always was, ready for the next time, because the road was still there, and the road had not changed. The Oatman Highway survived as the official Route 66 alignment until 1952, when it was finally bypassed by a level route through Yucca. The bypass did not come from conscience. It came from arithmetic, from enough accidents accumulating at the same location until the political cost of leaving the road alone exceeded the engineering cost of building around it. That was the mathematics of Bloody 66 from the beginning. How many deaths before something changes? The answer was always the same. More than it should have been. What the pavement remembers. In 1938, 12 years after the number 66 was painted over roads that mostly did not exist. The last unfinished stretch was paved. Every inch of 2,448 miles had a surface. Route 66 became the first highway in the United States to be completely paved from coast to coast. The Federal Highway Administration made it official. The highway was done. What those 12 years built was extraordinary, a continuous road across terrain that had broken travelers for centuries. The CCC and WPA workers who finished it between 1933 and 1938 were part of a national construction program that built 650 neuromiles of roads across Depression-era America, and Route 66 was the artery. The highway carried 210 Zuzuru Dust Bowl refugees west when there was nowhere else to go. It moved military materiel coast to coast during World War II, munitions out of California, ports to the Midwest industrial centers. workers flowing west into the war industries. It carried a generation of 1950s vacationers to Los Angeles in cars finally powerful enough to make the crossing comfortable. Route 66 was the economic spine of hundreds of towns that would not have existed without the traffic it generated. Without the galleon graders grinding through the Jericho Gap, without the CCC boys cutting retaining walls into the La Baja switchbacks, without the drilling crews above the Oatman Canyon walls working over the drop with friction fit hoses and $5 a month, none of it existed. John Steinbeck called it the Mother Road in 1939. He was right. It fed people when they were desperate. It moved a nation when the nation needed moving. Then the Interstate Highway System came. Eisenhower's Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 authorized 0 miles of controlled access expressway. Wide, straight, graded to modern engineering standards, with proper sight lines and proper shoulders and bridges designed for the loads they would actually carry. The interstates bypassed the Route 66 towns one by one. The traffic moved to the new roads and did not come back. Route 66 was officially decertified in 1985. The signs came down. The towns that had depended on it began to fade the same way Jericho, Texas, had faded when the Gap was bypassed in 1936. History running in a loop, but slower this time. The Federal Highway Administration called Route 66 the first highway to be completely paved in the United States when they made it official in 1938. That was the headline. What wasn't in the headline was the accounting. 12 years. 1,600 miles of unfinished road turned into pavement, volcanic cliffs cut by hand and explosive, an 18-mile trap of black gumbo in Texas defeated by a reroute, not by engineering, bridges that predated the cars crossing them, switchbacks that the machines couldn't navigate, an Arizona mountain pass that killed people until 1952 when they finally went around it. What's left is evidence that the nostalgia doesn't fully explain. You can still drive a 9-foot-wide strip of original 1920s pavement between Afton and Miami, Oklahoma, the Ribbon Road, so narrow that two cars meeting each other have to slow nearly to a stop to pass. The width of a city sidewalk. That was a state highway in 1924. You can drive the Oatman Highway over Sitgreaves Pass today. They've added guardrails since Buster Burris was cutting bodies off the old posts. The hairpins are still there. The grade is still there. Stand at the top of the pass and look down at the canyon and understand that this was the official Route 66 alignment for 26 years, that military convoys crossed it at night during wartime, that the Dust Bowl families in the 1930s road trip photographs crossed those hairpins in cars with drum brakes and gravity-fed fuel tanks and exactly no margin for error, and you begin to understand what the workers who built it were doing on those canyon ledges with pneumatic drills and friction fittings and $5 waiting at the end of the month. The ruins of Jericho, Texas still show where the Gap ran. The original alignment is a scar in the black clay readable in satellite photographs today, a rut the ground has never fully reclaimed. In Illinois, historical markers at Pontiac and Bloomington note plainly that Route 66 was one of the most dangerous roads in the nation. They don't elaborate. The record elaborates for them. Buster Burris is gone. His hacksaw is gone. The guardrail posts he cut through to free the dead have rusted back to nothing. But the principle he operated under was the same principle that built the road in the first place. You lay the steel, you paint the number, you open it to traffic, and you let the road tell you what you got wrong. Route 66 told America what it got wrong for 30 years and 2,448 miles. It told them at Devil's Elbow and the Jericho Gap and Sitgreaves Pass and La Bajada and Dead Man's Curve in Illinois and Blood Alley in Groom, Texas, and in Buster Burris's litany of stories from the Mojave Desert. The men who built it with pull graders and steam rollers and $5 a month and no safety net, literal or otherwise, did not get to hear any of those stories. They were already gone by the time the road opened. Their names are not on the monuments because the monuments were built for the road, not for the men who laid it down through the black gumbo and the volcanic rock and the canyon walls and the desert hardpan and the switchbacks that even the machines couldn't navigate. The road is what remained. The road remembered everything. They don't make them like that anymore. Not the roads, not the machines, and not the men.